The gravity of the time is such that every new avenue of peace, no matter how dimly discernible, should be explored. Never before in history has so much hope for so many people been gathered together in a single organization. You will provide a great share of the wisdom, of the courage, and the faith which can bring to this world lasting peace for all nations and happiness and well-being for all men.
We're here today with Greg Piefer, the founder and CEO of Shine Technologies. Thanks for joining us. I'd love to, before we get to the work that you do today, I'd love to learn about you and your background. Start us off. Where did you grow up?
Yeah, so I grew up in a town called Brookfield. It's a suburb of Milwaukee. Actually, kind of spent my time going to Brookfield schools, and then eventually ended up in Madison to go to college. Was a nerdy kid. Liked to read about things like nuclear fusion and particle accelerators, even back when I was in grade school. So, kind of set the interest in where I ended up early on. Liked Star Trek. Sort of saw ultimately nuclear fusion as a way to achieve that world, right? Where we could just do so many new things because we'd have such increased access to energy. So yeah, kind of a nerdy kid, into computers, into all those sort of things when I was young, and just kind of ended up following up with that.
Cool. And do you have parents who are engineers or anything like that?
My dad's an electrical engineer. My mom, she raised us kids. There were 4 of us, and that was a pretty busy job for her. I think she did a good job with it. But yeah, and I've just always, I think I've also just kind of always been good at sort of scientific things. I didn't have to work very hard in class, and those sort of classes came very naturally to me.
Cool.
Yeah.
So when you went to school, I guess you had this vision of wanting to get involved in, futuristic energy stuff. When you went to school, did that get further rooted in a specific discipline?
Well, it's kind of funny because, as a kid, I thought I could do anything. And then as I got older, I started to realize the world's a big place and it's full of lots of really talented people. And I kind of started to believe less, I guess, in my own ability to influence things. And then, through school, so I just decided to pursue a physics major as an undergraduate at University of Wisconsin, but it wasn't a great time for physics majors to get jobs at the time. And my parents had kind of been in my ear all along and saying, maybe you should be an electrical engineer like your dad. And my brother actually went into electrical engineering too. And what turns out was a good time for electrical engineers. Computers were really starting to take over. And so I added that major. I ended up adding a computer design major, and really wasn't working toward energy at all. Great job, particularly great jobs available in like graphics, card optimization design, hardware design, which obviously now is kind of the heart of parallel processing and AI and things like that.
And everything like that too.
Yeah. So that was like where I was going. It just so happens I took like a random class because I like to take random interesting classes. And one of them was called Resources from Space. And it was taught by 2 really awesome guys. Jerry Kolsinski, he ran something called the Fusion Technology Institute at the University of Wisconsin. And then a guy named Jack Schmidt who walked on the moon, right? How many, it's like 12 people who have ever done that. So, and he was the only scientist. He was the geologist that trained all the other, astronauts who were all military people what to look for. So they sent him up on Apollo 17, and the class was about going to space to get resources and bring them back to Earth for human use. And this was before it was cool. Like, it's actually kind of interesting today, and people are chasing it. But back then, they were sort of pioneers. And
what resources are on the moon that we care about?
Yeah, well, so one of the resources they're super interested in is something called helium-3. So there's a lot of. Yeah, right. And there's a lot of resources you can find in the lunar regolith to kind of make a society able to be not totally self-sufficient, but somewhat sufficient. And then helium-3 is the upside resource that they thought you colonize the moon. This is what they would send back to Earth, and in return, Earth would send technology up to this new colony on the moon, and you'd have a great economy, right? So it's pretty forward-thinking stuff. And it turns out that if you can do fusion with helium-3 as sort of the only fuel, the only reactant, so helium-3 fusing with helium-3, you would actually essentially produce almost all of your energy in the form of charged particles. You can do direct conversion to electricity. There's basically no nuclear waste. And the moon's got tons of it. The solar wind makes helium-3.
Can you actually describe how that works for a second? Why don't we have it on Earth, but they have it on the moon?
Yeah, exactly. So there's a little bit on Earth, produced from cosmic rays and maybe a little bit of decay, but not much. We have a lot of helium-4 from alpha decay within the crust, but helium-3 primarily comes from the sun and its reactions. And we have this beautiful magnetic field that protects us from the sun's charged particle radiation, including helium-3. So helium-3 that would be earthbound is deflected around the planet by our magnetic field. The moon has no such magnetic field, and thus for the last few billion years, it's been being bombarded with this resource.
Wait, so you're saying the helium literally gets shot out of the sun and travels and then lands on the moon, as opposed to something on the moon that gets knocked off by, like, an ionized by the radiation?
No, it's like directly implanted into the regolith from the sun.
Cool.
And like the first meter of it or so only. Yeah.
That's so cool. I didn't realize
that
actual atoms were flying out of the sun. I thought it was mostly particles or something. I don't know.
There's some of them are gamma rays and some of them are, electrons and other things. Some of them are neutrinos, lots of those. But some of them are helium-3. And so, it's just building up. And actually, really, all you have to do is pick the stuff up, heat it, and different volatiles come off at different temperatures. So, things like hydrogen and oxygen that you would need to support a lunar base, but also helium-3 at a certain temperature, and you collect it and then you set it back down. And so you just have you could imagine these little robotic miners that are doing nothing but picking up regolith, heating it up, collecting different things into tanks, and then setting it back down. So that was kind of this cool class. And they talked about mining asteroids and all that stuff too, but the moon was really intriguing to me. And then they were like, all you have to do is, figure out how to do fusion with this helium-3. And so I was like, that's pretty cool stuff. I got some good job offers, but maybe I should come work for you guys instead because you're doing more interesting stuff. So that's kind of how I got back into fusion. Jerry said, you should come work for me. You shouldn't take that job. And I agreed and ended up, in a research project at the UW on fusion.
Cool. So tell me a little bit about that, and tell me a little bit about what type of fusion is conducive to helium-3. I guess it's helium-3 plus helium-3 equals something.
It's helium-3 that was sort of their holy grail, really beautiful fusion reaction that they were talking about. And they actually believed at the time that there might be a nuclear resonance for the reaction to occur at low energy. And helium-3 is, frankly, no fusion.
When you say that, is that a nice way of saying cold fusion without being derided?
Yeah, maybe warm fusion is a better way to look at it. It would still be hotter than DT.
Okay. That's okay.
So warm for advanced fuels, but the hope was that at much lower energy, for helium, frankly, no fusion system is good for helium-3. Helium-3 get cut right to the chase. We don't know how to do that, and I don't know that we ever will. The temperature needs to be so high to cause good radioactivity or reactivity that you get a lot of Bremsstrahlung radiation, and even different configurations is not the best. So
I see. You were saying there was a theory that there's a I see. There's a theory that allowed you to do it, but in reality that hasn't played out.
Correct. So and the reason for the theory was there was this neutrino distribution they were measuring in the sun. And the only way they could come up with that sort of neutrino distribution was if helium-3 fusion were taking place at a much higher rate than it should have been in the core of the sun. So they proposed a resonance. Well, later on, they found out that neutrinos, I guess, can change color in flight. And so they can change the type of neutrino they are while traveling from the sun to the Earth. And so that completely explained the neutrino spectrum. So that resonance, and we tried to measure it experimentally, also did not find it. I've
heard this resonance thing before, and I've also heard this idea of these cascades and avalanches. Does any of these hold water? This idea that if we rather than trying to smash things together, if we could just manipulate certain atoms differently, that we can still get energy out of them by things jumping between shells or falling apart or something. What is all that?
Yeah, well, so nuclear resonance is a very real thing in nuclear physics, and particularly in what's called the epithermal spectrum for neutron reactions. You get these really weird, like typically it's a smooth continuum of like cross sections, so the reaction probability, it starts high at low temperature, and then it kind of degrades as you go to higher and higher speed for the neutron. But in the middle, there's like this really like up and down pattern, which are nuclear resonances. And for whatever reason, I'm not sure we totally understand them. It's far more likely that if you're in that very precise energy bin, where you're on the top of a resonance, that a nuclear reaction will happen. Actually in fusion, there's, one such fuel source we know of that has a resonance, a proton boron 11 fusion actually does have a lower energy resonance. The problem with it is like, if you're in a thermal distribution, like a plasma temperature, you call a plasma temperature like 100 keV or something like that. That doesn't mean all the particles in there are at 100 keV, right? They're broad. And so you have some that are much lower and some that are much higher. And in that distribution, that resonance gets completely washed out and essentially is ineffective. So there are these things, but it's really hard in thermal distributions to control whether or not you're on a resonance, for example. So yeah. That's very technical, I know, but it's kind of cool.
No. Our audience enjoys that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, at some point, I would love to explore this topic. We don't need to spend so much time on it now, but I'd love to explore at some point on this show if there is an entire category of physics that isn't really explored, but is still within our grasp if we understood it better. Instead of like, I'm not talking about like going super small, like quarks or anything, but I would like to know if there is at least the potential for a new method of energy extraction within like the range, like the realm of the reasonable that we're just not pursuing for whatever reason.
Yeah, that'd be fun. Yeah.
Okay, but please continue. Continue with your journey.
So that got me into fusion again. I went to actually study a specific technology called inertial electrostatic confinement fusion. And the idea behind this type of system is that you have a negatively charged electrode at the center of a device. You create positively charged ions near the edge of the device, and the ions would accelerate up to the potential of that electrode that's at the middle. And they would pass through it, and then they would recycle. And so they go back and forth. So you can imagine like one configuration is spherical. You've got a grid in the middle that's a spherical shell. You've got an ion source out at the end of a spherical vacuum chamber, and you just accelerate these particles in, and they're supposed to cross each other's paths and just keep recirculating until they hit the grid or something happens. And it was thought that you could get enough recirculation that eventually you'd have a beam collide with a beam in the system, and that would cause a reaction to happen. And it was thought to be potentially a non-thermal system, in fact. So interesting for things like P-boron 11 or going to advanced fuels like D-helium-3 or even pure helium-3, because everything that's colliding in the middle would be at the grid potential. And just by changing sort of the voltage on that grid, you would be able to very precisely control the temperature. It's essentially the velocity of the incident particles.
And sorry, what temperature does this? You said it's non-thermal. What temperature does this operate at?
Yeah, so I mean, IAC device, the grids can operate very easily at 100 plus kilovolts. So in theory, you should be producing 100 keV ions or 200 keV ions, which it translates in terms of temperature equivalent to like 1 billion degrees or more. So extremely high energy. The challenge is manyfold, actually, as we learned. The problem is like there's Coulomb cross section, so the probability of a particle scattering off of another particle from just charge, right? Even if it's a small scatter, that probability is much higher than the chance of a nuclei actually getting within range of a strong nuclear force.
Right.
And so eventually particles transfer energy into different directions, and they scatter, and some upscatter in energy, some downscatter in energy, and you start to thermalize, right, eventually. So you broaden the distribution. But even before that happens, we discovered in IAC devices that the particles just tend to collide with things, either the grid wires or background gas, and it makes it very difficult to get actually as much energy as you think you should be getting. So it turns out what was conceived of as a fairly easy solution is actually pretty hard. Imagine that in fusion.
How things go.
Yeah. So it was a really cool program. I learned how to make neutron sources. I learned about a bunch of applications for neutron sources, which actually will lead, as we get into the company, what we're doing now. But one thing I will say is, it was really an engineering program. And the Fusion Technology Institute in particular, the fourth floor, where me and my colleagues worked, focused on the engineering disciplines that would be required to commercialize fusion, less than the physics that would be required to actually make fusion reactions work and be exothermic. And so we were kind of thinking of the next step. We spent a lot of time thinking about the next step. And frankly, it was really discouraging. Because when you think about just how hard it is to go from, even if you have a burning plasma, to electricity generation, the materials challenges, at least at the time, were totally overwhelming. The ability to make superconductors at a reasonable size and strong enough that you could reduce the cost of these devices and compete with a combined cycle natural gas plant or solar panels or something like that was inconceivable to me. And so it really led me to be, frankly, pretty depressed about what I had chosen to do. I even read at one point an article, I think it was in one of the popular science magazines, maybe even Popular Science, and it's listed the top 10 worst graduate careers, and nuclear fusion was number 4. Nuclear
They were
fusion
just trying to
research.
be controversial at that point, probably.
Well, at the same time, though.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's because you spent your life pursuing this problem where you never seem to get any closer. And then you're also subject to government funding, turning things on and off, which you very much were.
Yeah. That's
and so there was never continuity. So I think they felt like they never had a chance really to deliver. And at the same time, it was really hard. So I kind of got frustrated in this way where I thought that I wouldn't be able to help bring fusion power to humans because I didn't see a way to make it scalable and practical.
But you didn't end up I'm sure they would have hired you as a quant on Wall Street.
I didn't do that either. As it turns out, I had some roommates that were entrepreneurial that I lived with. And one of them had a hard drive crash. So, just lost his data, and he had lots of stuff on there that he wanted to get back, pictures and things. And he went around online to look for data recovery solutions, and the best solutions were kind of pay us $5,000 up front, and then we'll try, and we may or may not get your stuff back. And so we kind of looked at that and thought that was pretty shitty kind of solution, right? So we ended up starting our own data recovery company just to provide people a better answer. And it was a really simple deal at the beginning. It was we're not that good at this. If you have no hope, we'll try to get your data back. And if we do, we'll charge you $100. And if we don't, you pay us nothing.
Wow, you guys are a good deal. $100.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
That was literally the business model. And you'd be surprised how many desperate people there were who had no other option.
I'd still do that for about 3 or 4 hard drives at home.
Yeah. And so we learned and we got good at it. We had tons of volume. And the logical repairs, the software-based repairs, we could do almost every single time. But electrical and mechanical failures took longer. We eventually were able to repair electrical control boards very easily and then ultimately repair the internals of a hard drive as well. So they're one of the best data recovery companies in the world right now. The FBI sends stuff to them. So, it's pretty cool. But anyway, it wasn't what I wanted to do, but it got me kind of educated on the ways of starting a business. And kind of bootstrapping and building. And so it was neat. It was really a fun experience. So as I got closer to graduation, frustrated as I was with Fusion, I decided that there were some things we could do with it today that would actually add value to the world that would be useful. And in particular, using the neutrons from DT reactions to provide a social and economic benefit. And yeah.
Neutrons from DT reactions, aren't there easier ways to get neutrons?
No, not really. You can build a nuclear reactor. That's not easy. the licensing pathway associated with that's pretty tricky.
Well, what about sources, like activated sources from nuclear reactors?
Yeah, so up to a certain point, yes. But beyond that point, they're just not strong enough.
Yeah, so tell me about that. What's
Yeah.
the details? What's the cutoff, and how does that affect different applications of how it's used?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think of the economics of these things. It would have cost, I know, for something to replace, like with Californium 252, which is produced at Oak Ridge, it would have cost, I think, trillions of dollars for us to buy enough Californium 252 to do the isotope business, which is not economically profitable. I can tell you, right? Like,
okay, but that's what I want to get to, because our audience maybe doesn't understand where we're going with all this.
Yeah.
So neutron sources are used for examination purposes already, right? But in low quantities, essentially,
and for very basic examinations. So like our first application of fusion was essentially to use neutrons for taking pictures, and it's called a neutron radiograph, and everyone's familiar with X-rays, where like X-rays pass easily through low Z materials, absorbed a lot by high Z materials. Neutrons kind of scatter quite a bit actually off of low Z materials. So you get a lot of attenuation of a neutron light source in light materials like plastics and carbon fiber. And so they're much better at imaging detail in those type of devices or those type of systems. And there was a real urgent need for it in that things like modern aircraft turbine blades. The turbine blades in these aircraft they're ceramic. They've got these super narrow cooling channels in them, and they melt so they're operating in an environment in the engine that is like 20% above their melting point. So it's absolutely essential that you like pull this cold air from the front of the engine, push it through this cooling channel, and out the blade tip or the engine would melt and it would blow up, right? So you need to know that these tips don't have a defect. And the manufacturing process that produces them has a pretty high failure rate. So, let's say 1% to 2% of the blades might fail. And an engine's got lots of blades, right? So most engines would blow up if you didn't have a way to inspect the turbine blades. So what historically has been done is there's just a few nuclear reactors which can make enough neutrons to do this that have produced those images. And so that's what happens. Like if you're a guy who makes these blades, you got to send them all to another site, nuclear reactor, image them there, get the film back, get the blades back, hope you didn't screw them up, and then build the engine.
And the idea here is, okay, so let me just kind of talk through it for a second. Okay, so
yeah.
Different categories of applications of neutrons that require a different, like, I don't know, would you measure it in flux? Is that how you would measure a quantity of neutrons?
Yeah, it's like, so flux is a number passing through an area per second, for example. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so there's some stuff that, because like, don't they do even like non-destructive examination of like bridges or something? Is that still with neutron sources, or was that the other thing? Like, what's an application where you use very few neutrons, but they're still neutrons as opposed to X-rays?
Yeah, one of the simpler applications uses a smaller source, but it's still not a radioisotopic source. Would be like
the cobalt 60, don't they put cobalt 60 in cases and stuff?
Yeah, but cobalt's gamma, so that would be
gamma.
X-ray.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, so if you're looking at bridges metal, actually, like gamma is really good for metal.
Okay, so there's some stuff that you can use gamma. Then you get to when you need to use neutrons, and then there's a category of things that you can use a medium amount of neutrons, let's say, for like this non-destructive examination of the foil blades or something.
Right.
And then there's this other category where volume actually is the key, and we're going to get to that, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's increase. There's a few steps where you go to higher and higher volume. Well, actually, the way we think about it is actually lower and lower cost per neutron to access these increasing markets. But
okay, cool. Yeah. Okay. I'd like to hear your paradigm for it. So please continue.
Yeah. So having been frustrated but not really wanting to give up on fusion, just because I will say this very clearly, it is the way humans will produce energy someday. It takes us to an inexhaustible source. The energy density.
I have different opinions on that, though. Okay.
Well, here, look, we're talking someday, right? So we can argue about when, but I actually think ultimately it's the way we're going to go.
I have a different quibble with it, but
yeah.
I want to see where you're going with your stuff first.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's my belief, right? So my belief is we never run out of energy as a species. And I'm talking about a species that could consume millions of times the energy we consume as a species today and still never run out, right? So like fusion is the way the universe makes energy. So look up at the light, all the light you see in the universe essentially comes from fusion.
Except it's very low power density, all the light that you see. What I'm getting, I think nuclear is the energy of future civilizations. I'm not sure. Well, I do think there's good applications for fusion. I'm not sure like mass energy production is the one, as compared to fission, of course. But we can get there. We can get there.
I see fission as a transitional step. I think fusion increases access to energy by orders of magnitude beyond that. So,
what's the downside of fission as compared to fusion that you say?
The downside of fission is, well, ultimately availability of the resource. So you can try to breed more and more fuel as you want, but
there's a billion years of uranium.
A billion years at how much energy consumption? So
at 100% of today's.
Yeah, but so what? Who wants to stay at 100% of today's?
No, I agree. I want to go 100-fold of today's.
What if you want to go to a million-fold of today's?
10 million years, which we are not going to be. We are not going to be like in this form of humanity in 10 million.
So what? It's like if you look at chemical energy, it served us for the last million. Fusion will serve us for the next million. Where fission and how long of a role it plays, fine. We can talk about that, right? But it's probably not the next million. And it's probably not, well, I mean, up till now, it's been chemical. So, I agree fission's a transitional step. I think fusion, look, we could probably spend a lot of time on this, but I think fusion is probably what takes us ultimately to almost unlimited access.
Okay. So I guess let's work through your system. So, all right. So you saw some of the need.
Yeah. So, I didn't see a way to commercialize fusion. And I think for energy, but we did see these near-term applications, particularly non-destructive testing, actually looking like, neutrons can also, instead of just doing radiography, they can tell you something about the isotopic build of whatever you're looking at. So chemical composition, things like that. So if you're looking for explosive devices, or if you're looking for uranium hidden in materials, neutrons can do that in a way that X-rays just can't, right? So there were a lot of neat applications for this, defense, security, just safety in general. So I started a company called Phoenix, at the time it was Phoenix Nuclear Labs, to commercialize that product. And eventually, they did, and that company is actually now part of Shine.
Commercialize what product exactly?
Yeah, so there were three different product lines we produced out of Phoenix. So they're what we call beam solid target neutron sources. So this is with a particle beam shooting into a solid target. And that would produce a certain number of neutrons per second.
And what is this beam?
Yeah, so in this case, it's a deuterium beam, and typically shooting into a deuterium target because most people don't have the ability to safely handle tritium. Tritium being a radioactive gas.
And how do you accelerate deuterium?
Yeah, so in this case, we're using a simple, what's called an electrostatic accelerator. So actually most of the black magic is up front where you make the beam. So we'll take deuterium, we'll excite it with microwaves, just like the same type of microwaves you use to heat up your food. Only we're heating it up enough where the electrons separate off. They have enough kinetic energy that they're no longer bound. So you have a plasma. It's a combination of positive deuterium ions, negative electrons. And then we take that whole plasma source, we push it up to a big positive voltage relative to the system we want it to accelerate into. And so those positive charges are attracted down to the ground side of the system because it's too much free positive charge, right? All that positive charge repels. And so that's it. And that's how we make it go.
And had this already been done before at the lab scale and you simply commercialized it, or were you proving something new in this case?
Yeah, so beam target fusion had been done for a long, long time. Not at the scale we needed to do it at. So, we went to far more powerful particle beams than had been done before.
So what size is this entire device?
So a solid target device is, I want to say something like all in, maybe 10 feet long, something like that.
Like the size of a conference room table or something.
Yeah. Yeah, and then if you build a moderator around it, then that can take up a lot more space because you want thermal neutrons, for example.
Well, I guess I meant the entire product. If you were to sell this to like border security or something.
Yeah, exactly. So it depends on the customer. So 10-ish, 12-ish feet is the way to think about the product for like interrogating a cargo container, in which case you would have the contents of the container do some of the thermalization. If you're doing radiography, you've got to do all the thermalization yourself and then collimate the beam. So that's what we would do for radiography. We actually have a moderator around the neutron source, and we have a bunch of collimators in there that allow us to take pictures. So the sort of that beam target fusion was kind of like the lowest output, the entry point kind of system. We actually then took our technology and made kind of a mid-output system, but not fusion based. So using cyclotrons to accelerate protons and strike sort of a boron target. But the technology we developed for the fusion-based targets was applicable to this. And that kind of gave us a mid-range output source. And then we had a really high-range output sources, which are actually deuterium particle beams striking a tritium gas target, which is again fusion, and those are the highest output systems. So kind of application dependent on what we call our phase 1 applications. And all of those are for non-destructive testing of some kind.
And where do the licensing bodies come into play on this? For any of the devices that you mentioned so far, do you need to get NRC approval to build them?
Yeah, you don't. Although if you're in a non-agreement state, you would. If the NRC is... Yeah, so some states have an agreement with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that allows them to regulate this type of stuff. So Wisconsin, for example, is an agreement state. They've got their own Department of Health Services, which has a capability to understand radioactive material and dose and things like that. And so they would provide a license for this type of system. Some states don't have that capability and they just depend on the NRC. So in a non-agreement state, you would actually have to get an NRC license for something like this.
And in the case of like Wisconsin, how much work do you have to do with them, with their State Department, to get approval for this type of thing?
I mean, they want to understand that it's safe. So depending on how good of a case you make, it may go faster or slower. It's typically like you think about it, if they don't know you and you make a pretty good safety case, like a year of review, doesn't really cost you money. That's significant. I mean, it's not like the NRC, right? Like a device registration in the state of Wisconsin, I think is like $50. So, you just got to convince them it's safe to operate, and you do that with a submission and analysis and all that.
That's cool. And then is there a threshold of, I guess, activity in which it clearly crosses into NRC territory?
There's not, in terms of just activity. Depending on which radioisotopes you have, it could cross into, and particularly when you involve special nuclear materials, so things that have a high fission cross section, that pushes you pretty quickly into NRC domain in general. But other than that, like activity wise, not so much. I would say that if you get beyond the competencies of the state's ability to license and feel like they could do an analysis that proves it's safe, they may ask the NRC to either assist or take over.
And what are they looking for in terms of safety? Is it just essentially like how much radiation is produced and where the people are in proximity to that?
Yeah, basically. I mean, yeah, they want you to fall within regulatory dose limits. And then they want to know in general that you're capable of following an ALARA-like concept and what that means and that you have good safety culture. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. All right. So those were the devices under Phoenix. And then what happened with Shine? What is the story?
Yeah. So and even while commercializing sort of the devices with Phoenix, felt really good that maybe we could expand the technology. And again, think about total neutron output increasing by like 1,000-fold, which is actually what we needed to do to get to what we call phase 2. But also the cost per neutron going down by almost that same amount. Then at that point, we'd have enough neutrons to now not just take pictures, but to actually do transmutation. So our goal is to turn low value or non-valuable things into what we'll call hyper valuable things. Super is not even a big enough word. So
like alchemy.
Yeah, alchemy but you would never spend your time turning lead into gold because gold's way too cheap. It wouldn't be worth it. But we could do something like turn uranium, that we can buy at sort of market rates into medical products, isotopes such as molybdenum-99 or iodine-131.
By splitting it.
By fissioning it, yeah. You could also do it with neutron capture.
That's what I was going to say. Why not just build up from an isotope as opposed to splitting one?
Yeah, and you could put molybdenum. So moly-99 is the most important medical isotope in the world. It's used in 40 million tests a year around the globe every year. So it's crazy how important it is, but the supply chain actually sucks. Like that's a whole nother topic. It's dying. But yeah, so one way you can produce is by neutron capture. Actually, that's how the world did it like 50 years ago. And you would take either naturally occurring moly or you'd enrich moly-98, which is the isotope that captures it, and turn it into moly-99. So absolutely can make it that way. You can make quantities of it that way in reactors, but it's got one little drawback, which is, you're starting with this large bulk of moly, or moly-98 if it's enriched, and the capture cross-section's pretty low. And so you end up with a tiny, tiny bit of moly-99 in this very large bulk of molybdenum. And there's no
separate that easily.
Exactly, right. The only thing you could do is isotopic enrichment, which takes time. And the stuff's got a 66-hour half-life, so you don't have time. So you end up, like, even in the best reactors, like the University of Missouri's got this flux trap that goes up to super high neutron flux. And even there, you're going to get at best, like, let's say 5 curies per gram in the final product. And so that, like I said, that's how it was done. It was then replaced by fission moly. A company called Syntachem came to market in the 60s. And fission moly replaced it completely. And the reason fission moly replaced it completely is because you're starting with a large volume of uranium. But actually the fission cross-section specific to moly is actually quite a bit higher than the capture cross-section for moly-98. So the probability of making a moly-99 with any given neutron is much higher. And then on top of that, it's a different element. So stripping uranium and molybdenum apart from each other is quite trivial. It's not super easy, but it can be done, right? And it can be done really, really quickly. And so Syntachem developed a process to do that. And they were producing moly that was, more like 50,000 curies per gram. And so that end product is tremendously more concentrated, like 10,000 times more concentrated. And that made it much easier to use. That led to the conventional Illumina generator, which is what proliferates the market today. It allowed pharmacies to, be able to produce hundreds of doses per night from a single generator very quickly, very efficiently. And so the scale of the current nuclear medicine market kind of depends on that fission-based moly being there. And there have been a number of people who have tried very clever solutions and still are even trying very clever solutions to make neutron capture moly work. But it always amounts to being more work for the pharmacist at the end of the day, because the only way to get back that specific activity is to wait for it to decay into technetium. 6-hour half-life. You can't do that in a central facility. You got to do that closer to the patient. So the pharmacist now needs to wait for it to decay into technetium, and then you do the separation. So you're making the pharmacist do that hard separation rather than doing it in one central location.
Got it. Okay.
So they obviously would rather not do that.
Yeah. Okay, so where do you come in?
Yeah, so we had this neutron source. We were scaling nicely. We were developing the gas target technology. Felt really strongly that we'd be able to scale it up to isotope production. Had experimental data at low power with tritium. But we felt we knew the cross sections really well and knew kind of what was going to come out of that. So I actually decided to apply for federal assistance. There was a 2010 FOA funding opportunity announcement from the Department of Energy that said, hey, we got this moly-99 problem. And the problem was twofold. Number one, the current supply chain was failing because it was all dependent on 60-year-old reactors that were going offline unpredictably. And then the second thing was they were exporting bomb-grade uranium to use as the feedstock for the moly. And the U.S.
Why was that?
Yeah, so it's just, it produces less waste. It's easier for the processor to use, lower, thinner targets, less self-shielding. There's a lot of reasons it's just easier to use HEU foils in a conventional reactor to make moly-99. So we were exporting I don't think the government has said this anywhere publicly, so I'll say I believe on the order of 2 nuclear weapons worth of HEU per year to support the US's consumption of Moly-99.
Wow.
And so there was a lot of work over a long period of time, going all the way back to 1992, and through multiple laws being passed to try and eliminate the export of HEU for this purpose.
High enriched uranium.
Yeah, and so what happened around the 2010 timeframe was three things happened actually. One, there was a new reactor that had been built to solve all the supply chain problems in Canada. Actually, 2 of them. They're called Maple 1 and 2, and each of those reactors was supposed to cover global demand, and that was the future. So that was killed around 2010. They actually finished construction, started to commission them around 2000. They were designed to have a negative power coefficient, and over a certain part of the operating range had positive power coefficient, and they could never figure out why. And so they eventually stopped funding it and killed the project. So the future went away in terms of stability of supply. Then on top of that, the 2 biggest remaining producers, which were an old reactor in Canada called the NRU and another reactor in the Netherlands called the HFR, went down unexpectedly at the same time for major repairs that needed to be done. So they were down for many months. And so millions of patient doses were missed over this time period, probably over 10 million actually. So you've got this huge disruption to the supply chain. And the NNSA folks decided to say, look, there's a problem. We need to fix it. We need a better supply chain. We're going to invest money in people that can solve our HEU problem and shore up the supply chain. So that's basically what the FOA was about. We applied. And as Phoenix at the time.
I'm surprised, honestly, though, that this is like a traditional FOA. To me, like the level of emergency, I don't understand why this wasn't like a sole source, like $1 billion contract to just anyone who can do it. We're going to give you money to make it happen. Like this is a medical emergency for our country.
Yeah, I totally agree with you.
Like it seems like, oh, I just created an FOA, just like any other like ridiculous things they create FOAs for that like we don't actually need. Like this is something we really need.
Yeah, well, and you and I would be, I'm sure, in agreement on this thing. We should probably be doing that with nuclear power plants right now, given climate and given. I actually believe very strongly that right now we should be building nuclear power plants, fission-based, traditional, stuff. That's basically it. So they did this FOA. We lobbed in a proposal because we said, look, we can do this with sort of fusion technology as the primary neutron source, but irradiating a uranium target and allowing that target to be reused, which is another sort of innovation that we brought to the table. So. Our technology. A bit more
about that? Explain.
Yeah, so our technology, even though we could produce enough fusion neutrons to drive the system, it was still going to be much lower flux than a reactor core. And because it's lower flux, the only way, so again, enough neutron output, but it's too distributed, and the neutrons per square centimeter per second are much lower. And so.
Can I ask you a quick question? I should know this, but. Is there any way to, other than like creating like a viewport, is there any way to control the direction of neutrons, or is it all like random and probabilistic after it's created?
Yeah, so from a fusion reaction and from fission, they have a random distribution, so they're basically isotropic.
There's no way to like create like sheets of material of various like densities and cross sections that in their aggregate end up bouncing things into a common direction. Is there just nothing like that?
My belief is that there is not. There are people who will say they can do that. I have not seen that. And fundamentally, that it's an optics type problem, but the distance a neutron travels before it collides again is just too great. And so you would need to build these massive optics, and they would have to not absorb neutrons at all. And so, I don't know, I guess you could build something out of deuterium ice, right, which has a really low neutron absorption cross-section, and it'd be just massive lens, and maybe then, right? Like if you force enough collisions, maybe then. But the problem is most materials absorb neutrons before you could ever force enough collisions to do it. They do try and do it with really cold neutrons. And really cold neutrons, like cryogenic neutrons, the probability of interacting goes way up at those temperatures. So suddenly your optics can be more reasonably sized. So there is some of that with really cold neutrons. But at that point, you've lost a lot just cooling them off.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So sorry, back to, all right. So
yeah, low flux, enough neutrons, but low flux. So how do you take advantage of that? Well, you need a big target. And that's basically what we had to do. The challenge with a big target, if it's, so traditionally a reactor would irradiate like a foil or a uranium metal of some kind, right? And that foil would then be taken out and dissolved. And there's only so much room to put these foils in these reactors because they're not really designed for it. So you can't just put big targets in reactors, but we were starting from scratch. So we could use a big target. And the challenge with using a really big solid target, which is what conventionally would be done, is you need to dissolve a really big solid target every week. And then you'd have all this waste uranium, right, which you couldn't use. And you'd have to then, if you wanted to use it economically, you'd then have to reconstitute that back into a solid target again, only it's radioactive as hell at this point. Yeah. So reconstituting it back into a solid target would be very expensive. So we said, well, what about aqueous solutions? So we decided we'd put uranium in salt form, we'd dissolve it, and we would irradiate it right there as a liquid. And that actually works. So you can irradiate it as a liquid, and the target can be much bigger. And then you can run it through a larger separation column. The uranium, it's designed so it's like we use titania. The uranium doesn't stick to the titania, it goes right through. The
titanium as the vessel wall.
No, titania, sorry. So titania is a titanium dioxide.
Titanium dioxide for what?
For separating out. So actually, so we'll run this liquid. So we'll cook it for like 5.5 days. So the fusion system's on 5.5 days. It's cooking this soup. And then at the end of that, we'll open a valve and we'll pump it through, think of it like a 2-liter bottle, of soda. And that contains like titanium dioxide. So it looks like white sand, right? It kind of looks like sand. And the chemistry of the solution is such that the uranium passes through this material, but the molybdenum forms a chemical bond with it.
Okay, now I understand. Okay, you're creating a filter out of the titanium.
Yeah, so it's like
what's the salt though? What's the uranium salt? What type of salt?
So we're using uranyl sulfate. Yeah, it's a sulfate. Okay, cool. Yeah. And people had pursued both nitrates and sulfates for aqueous homogeneous reactors in the past. So we actually
can you just buy that, or how does that, or you have to make it in-house, or how do you get the uranium into a sulfate solution?
Yeah, so we can make it in-house. So what we would typically do is buy uranium metal.
At what enrichment? At what enrichment?
So 19.75. So we'll be buying the what do they call it? Haliev stuff from Oak Ridge.
Okay, so that's available. You can just buy that on the market
if you have the right licenses to possess it. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say on the market. We had to sign a uranium lease and take back agreement with the government and all that stuff. So, there's all kind of.
I know a lot of the HALEU nuclear reactor companies are having so much trouble procuring it, but you're saying it is available if you have a license?
Well, it's available if you have a license today. At some point, I think if you have a lot of HALEU-based reactors, it becomes a problem. Yeah. The stockpile they have comes from weapons surplus, and we made a lot of bombs, too many bombs. They decided they had too much enriched stuff. So they did all this work to enrich it to like 90+%. And then they downblended it all back down to 20%. And so that's the stuff we're using. It's actually kind of a cool part of our story because we're like taking stuff that was meant for nuclear bombs and turning it into medicine like directly.
So cool. Okay, wait. So you get it from them and it's in some sort of metallic form?
Yeah, it's like low metal chunks. So like they enriched it in metallic form because that's how you make a bomb, right? They want HEU metal. And then they chewed up the bombs and mixed it with uranium metal from the ground. And so we get these chunks and we'll oxidize them, which is basically as simple as putting them in a furnace and heating them up. And then we dissolve them in the sulfate.
And you do this in your lab in Wisconsin? Yeah,
we do this in-house. Look, if it were opportunistic to pay someone to do it for us and it saved us some space and we could open up a room in the building for other things, we might do that. But right now, while we're commercializing, we want to control as many things as we can.
It's totally fine, especially.
Yeah. So,
all right, so you do that, you get into the uranium sulfide solution.
Yeah.
Put it into this, I guess, bubble surrounding your fusion reactor.
Yeah. Think of it as like I'm forgetting the word right now. It's just like a cylinder, right? And it's with a open center. It's an annulus.
How big is it? How big is the whole thing?
We're not supposed to say exact dimensions, but you can kind of get your arms around it,
Okay, so like a
a couple hundred. I mean, it holds a couple hundred liters, and it's not solid, so the middle is open.
Okay, great.
And
I just wanted to know if it was like the size of a building or the size of a table.
Yeah, no, it's not that big. You can kind of get your arms around it.
Okay.
And then, the fusion device, the gas target in this case. So there's a deuteron source up at the top of the machine. It shoots a beam down towards this annular target, and it hits a tritium gas envelope that's inside of the annulus. And so then the DT neutrons that come out of that, they come out isotropically. Pretty much all of them have to pass through that annulus containing the uranium solution, and that's what caused the fission.
Cool.
So, yeah.
And then you mentioned like 5 days. What's the half-life of the moly that you're trying to create, though?
Yeah, so moly's like 66 hours. So we're not at saturation at 5.5 days, but you're also not producing 1 for 1. You're losing some.
That's what I'm wondering. Yeah, walk me through that exactly. So some of the stuff that you are creating, you are losing before you extract it.
Yeah, and that's always going to be the case.
Time, though, if they're, how does this work?
I mean, from my standpoint and our business's standpoint, it might be every 2 or 3 days. Unfortunately, though, radiologists at the end of the day run the world, and they like to play golf on Friday and they like to do tests on Monday. So, they've got their weekly cadence that they want to take patients at. And so, customers usually right, or at least you try and give them what they want. So we're trying to feed a supply chain that wants moly on certain days.
How come there's no continuous process where you can just be constantly circulating the stuff through some sort of and extracting the moly in situ, or like how does?
You could do that. However, the market doesn't want it that way. So you'd be doing all this extra work to continually be running highly radioactive loops in your plant and separating.
So you're saying is the customer, the hospital, actually wants a batch delivery on a day, every week.
Yeah, they like certain days. They like to have their batches. So we just tailored our radiation cycle to be as efficient as possible while giving them what they want.
Perfect sense.
Yep.
And by the way, I love your thinking about building a system to what the customer asks for instead of just what you want. I
would have never started. The first conversation I had before I started Shine, and even though we thought we could do it, was to go and talk to GE and say, tell me about the product you want, because I'm not going to waste my time if I don't make what you guys want, right? So, those were meaningful conversations in the early days.
And sorry, so and then how have you established your your sales process? Like, who do you sell directly to? Is there like a middleman?
Yeah, there are middlemen. There's like a couple of actually. Yeah. So like
you don't have to worry about calling up a bunch of hospitals.
Yeah, right. That's right. It was actually a good thing for us. Like our sales team is like 2 people or maybe 3 people, so, and it probably will never get much bigger than that. So if you have a company trying to get a new drug in the market, their sales team is their primary expense. We don't have that cost at all, essentially.
And sorry, just to come back to the NRC, what role did they play in this device? And how does that
so as I mentioned, once you bring special nuclear material into the picture, they're going to be more interested in it. And we very quickly came to the realization that, we were going to trip some of the NRC's, sort of like automatic, this is our review kind of thing. And frankly, the state of Wisconsin is really good at what they do. But, assessing criticality and assessing accident scenarios around actual decent sized fission systems, like each one of our fusion driven systems actually is like 125 up to 125 kilowatts of thermal fission happening in it. So, it's like it's a nice hybrid.
That's not nothing. Yeah, that's awesome.
Right. So like, that's not going to be licensed by the state of Wisconsin. They just don't know how to do it. So we would have went to the NRC. We'd have got there one way or another. So we just chose to.
And what was that? Tell me about that process. What was it like for them? Had anyone working there ever seen anything like this? Did they have a division to even analyze this?
Yeah, so the research and test reactor group is who this fell under. And I'm kind of glad it did, because they were just a little bit more flexible in their thinking. We also started talking to them before I actually founded Shine as a company too. And we hit them right as they were so they were collaborating with NNSA. And aware that the U.S. was going to make it a priority to establish domestic supply chains. And so they actually created what they called at the time draft interim staff guidance that would kind of set the framework for them to license medical isotope production facilities. And so we got input in that. And so one of the things they actually had in their ISG was like fusion-driven subcritical fission medical isotope production scheme. So they had listened to us about what we wanted to do and tried to build a framework around it because they knew this was a national priority at the time.
How long did it take to get the license?
Oh yeah, so I mean, it's still a really thorough process. Part of it's on us, part of it's on them. The construction permit we applied for in 2013, that was granted in 2016. And then we applied for our operating license in 2018, and that review is expected to complete actually this year. So while we produce the stuff at pilot scale, the large scale facility is still being constructed. In fact, it's out my window here.
I see. Okay, so to help me understand this part, because this is super interesting. So you're able to actually do it and run a system. And are you actually delivering doses to hospitals today?
No, except that we are with lutetium, one of our therapeutic products, but
you're able to run a subcritical reactor at small scales before you have the operating license.
Yeah, we did do that in partnership with Argonne. And so Argonne already used their on-site licenses to do those tests.
Cool.
And we were also able to draw a tremendous amount of data from the aqueous reactor database. So the Russians and the US government did a tremendous amount of work with aqueous homogeneous reactors, which is a lot what our liquid target looks like, even though it's being driven by fusion.
And okay, so you applied for the operations license when?
Yeah, 2018.
2018. And when do you expect to get it issued?
It'll get issued probably when the facility is done. So they'll we expect them to complete their review around the end of this year. So that'll again be about 3 years. And you could argue it might have been faster to go for a combined license application, but we needed to retire risk as a startup in order to get funding to do stuff. Yeah, so and it was also really important because the design needed a lot of iteration between the construction permit application and the actual what we've built. So we expect to finish building this and have the equipment in and sort of be able to start up and receive the operating license around the middle of next year.
And all in regulatory cost.
Oh, geez. Yeah, it's tens of millions. I mean, I think, that's counting a lot of the work we have to do internally to answer questions. But the NRC is also a cost recovery organization. So I forget what their current rate is. It's probably $280 an hour or something like that. So whatever their review time is, we pay for that.
And nothing, I mean, given how important this, I mean, what you were doing is incredibly important. Was there a sense of urgency, or their allies in government that could understand the sense of urgency to help accelerate this?
Yeah, and it's been bipartisan, which has been really nice. But at the same time, they've got their job to do, which is to make sure this stuff is all safe, and it's pretty complicated. So,
what are they looking for? Can't you test things at the limits and say, listen, it can never go critical because of X, Y, Z. Here are the few simple equations that prove that. We just simply don't have that material. What are they actually looking for?
Well, they want to understand the source terms. They want to understand the release patterns. They want to, anything that can go wrong in the facility. So we're pumping this stuff around. What if a pipe fails? What's the analysis look like? What happens to the farmer who lives next to our site? So
there's no way they can just handle probabilistically, with PRA or PSA style analysis, where you just say, listen, we're going to, show you some of the worst case scenarios, show you how the source term release still isn't that bad. Multiply it.
That's actually what we did. I mean, we ended up designing to what they call maximum hypothetical accidents, which are limiting cases, right? And PRAs are great if you have a source of data for to drive the probabilities. But when you build a first of a kind thing that no one's ever seen before,
I was just hoping maybe you could just reasonably agree with some level of conservatism what the probabilities are. Yeah,
but you've still got to do even in the limiting cases, you've got to determine what the limiting cases are, right? So
of course, there's going to be some deterministic component.
Yeah. So, I think the approach was pretty good, but it's a long. It'd be nice if it could go faster. I met with the commissioners at one point in a public meeting, and Allison McFarland was chair at the time, and I said, look, you've obviously got to do your job. I would never ask you not to. This has got to be safe, but hey, this is important for the country, important for patients and all that. So the faster you can go would be greatly appreciated by everybody. And she just looked at me and she was like, hey man, you're going at the speed of light. through this thing. So, and I don't think she was being facetious. I think she's actually being very complimentary about our organization. She's like, I'm really impressed that, you guys have been able to go this fast through the organization. So.
Yeah, but it's not the speed a lot. And this is what, I mean, this drives me crazy. Before the NRC, there was the Atomic Energy Commission, and they were able to license full gigawatt scale power plants in like for a year for like under $1 million with like three competent engineers just showing the limiting case scenario and saying, okay, like we all agree. And there's some cost benefit analysis. Are you even allowed to have that conversation with the NRC about a cost benefit analysis, or is it no, we don't care what the benefit is?
I think you can always have any conversation with the NRC as far as we've had experience, but I think that they're going to probably think about it a little bit differently than we would.
I get it, but like your benefit is so obvious. Like I could be like, I am saving millions of lives. And the worst case scenario that you could possibly imagine doesn't even kill a person. It just maybe subjects them to some like dose that is like maybe above a limit, but doesn't hurt them.
Yeah.
And we like be reasonable here. Yeah.
Yeah. But then they want us to prove that. And, then they want us to like make sure we've analyzed everything. And then they want to look at the analysis we've done and make sure we did it right. And I mean, that is how it's done today. I agree with you. Cost benefit analysis has to absolutely come back. I think, one of the concepts that we talked about already, Alara, is a perfect example of that. The word reasonable needs to be assessed in terms of cost benefit thinking. And I think it's like super easy for me to do that, but a lot of people just don't like making comparisons. I don't know why. But like Alara should be all about cost benefit analysis. Like we're going to stay below the dose limits, but if we're producing product and that's going to save somebody's life down the road and we have to incur an additional 10 milligram of dose to make sure it gets to that person on time, should we do that? Probably, right? I mean, it all depends on the certain nuances that are going on at the time, but like if we can't avoid it and that patient's probably going to die because they've got late stage cancer, that's reasonable to me, right? And I think it should be reasonable to anybody.
Yeah, same, but it's a misnomer. When they say reasonable, they don't actually mean reasonable. They mean it's an excuse to hit zero. Like they don't actually mean reasonable.
But that's not reasonable.
But it's not. It's a misnomer. The whole Alara thing is a misnomer. The reasonable part.
And that needs to change. That needs to change. That prevents us from doing really important things in the world. Like making medicine, but even like making carbon-free energy. It can drive costs up that make it impossible. Just that sort of thinking. Absolutely. Was
there any thought to, I mean, you're so close to Canada already. Did you have any conversation with their regulators and ask them if there was a faster path there?
With Canada?
Yeah.
The only conversations we had with them were, that they would behave very similar to the NRC.
That's what I heard.
That's kind of the way they put it.
Yeah. And I guess any other country is too far actually to fly the isotopes cost effectively.
Well, and it's a disadvantage if you're not in Canada for the US. And the other, challenge we had is a lot of our early funding came from this partnership with the NNSA, who is very much trying to establish domestic production. And
why couldn't you just have done it on Argonne's campus?
Oh, yeah. No, I would never recommend that to anyone.
Why not?
Frankly, the lab regulators are even more, they're very risk intolerant. Let's just say that.
Even more than 2013 to 2023? I mean, that's a lot of risk intolerance.
I wouldn't build anything on no commercial site on a lab campus. I mean, they ultimately control you and they're the government, right? They're the biggest target in the world financially. Everyone would love nothing more than to sue them for this and that. And it's just like, even at Argonne, like the tests we did there, right? Like they had some missteps on some of those tests. And even though nobody was hurt and, doses weren't very high, it shut them down for years. And, the fix was easy, right? So it's just like the sensitivity, I think, of being the government being this huge target has made them extremely risk intolerant. We actually looked at building one of these in the production complex out near Los Alamos as well. So we looked at these things, but you're going to end up investing probably as much or more money. Maybe you could go faster, but then you're not going to have control over your site. You're going to be completely subject to the other things going on in the lab and its political hierarchy.
Since your system is fairly small, was there any conversation with the NRC of like, listen, if we just wrap this thing in like 20 feet of concrete and don't have a human operator, everything is operated remotely, like, can we make this a little easy? Like, was there any conversation, like, is there a shortcut in terms of like how we think about dose?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we like our MHAs, so our maximum hypothetical accidents, for example, which are things that can't even happen, right? They have no physical initiator. They're postulated events, like, you know, a barrier disintegrates. And even those, you know, the dose that that Randy used, my friend, actually, he's the guy who farms all this land around here. If he didn't leave when we asked him to evacuate after an accident, after an MHA occurs, and he not only that stayed there the rest of his life and didn't ever go home again, he would receive less than a CT scan of dose, right? I mean, so
why is that not the end of the safety analysis right then and there? To me, that sounds like the end of it.
Yeah. Well, there are some things you depend on to make sure that that's it, right? It's not a parking lot release. You have to show, I mean, if it were just wrapping it in concrete, right? Like, you got to prove the concrete's safe. And you got to prove that the natural breathing rate of the
there's no
building.
sense of like reasonableness. Like, hey, if we pour 20 feet concrete walls, they're going to be
No,
there.
not without analysis. No, that doesn't exist. Yeah. Like, just like what would,
common sense. You're not allowed to use common sense.
no common sense. No, it's all analysis driven. And we haven't even, I mean, honestly, we haven't tried to push the limits on that. You know, everything we've seen has indicated that common sense is not going to be well received. And you got to understand, a lot of people at the NRC too, like, they're hiring a lot of people outside as, you know, sort of contractors to come in and do the analysis work themselves. So those people are going to be really opposed to not doing analysis because that's how they get paid, you know, so.
Yeah, those are all messed up.
Yeah.
And was there any, just to kind of keep on this, because like I think about this as I advise other nuclear reactor companies, including my own, like of other regulators, first demonstrate it, like, at a full, even though I know the need is here in the US, get a fully functional system up and running in, let's say, you know, pick a country, France, whatever. Maybe, example, but something with a regulator that Argentina, I know a lot of the Argentinians, very PRA driven, very common sense, very competent, have built all sorts, including isotope reactors, reactors. Any sense of like doing it there first, showing that it works, and then just showing the NRC the data from that system to like make that.
I think it's helpful. I think they'll still make you do the analysis, at least today. Yeah. So if you haven't done it, you're still going to have to do it, is my experience. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's that, I guess.
I mean, it's today, right? You know, my hope is that, at least with respect to things like ALARA, where you're allowed to do that. I mean, ALARA was designed, like, the word reasonable was put right in there, right? Like, it was designed to allow consideration of trade-offs.
I don't think it ever was. I think it was a misnomer from the beginning.
Yeah, maybe that's what was intended.
I actually think that there's like real, I wouldn't say malicious intent, but I would say the wrong incentives coming from within the nuclear industry itself. Just like you said, half the nuclear industry are safety analysis performers. And so it's the nuclear experts themselves that are misrepresenting the danger to give them more work.
I couldn't agree with that more. And I think, frankly, the nature of reimbursement in the nuclear business being largely cost plus for a long time provides an incentive to be expensive and to go to zero, right? There's no way to make more money than to try to go to zero. And who benefits from going to zero? Essentially no one, other than the people who are getting paid to do it. I agree. I think, you know, we need to have that argument, and that one should be one, because it is just about societal trade-offs, right? Like, why should I slightly, even if you believe in linear no threshold theory, which of course I don't, and I think is absolutely ridiculous. But even if you do and you're required to, like, why should somebody receiving an incrementally larger dose that, you know, is so far below any proven, say, you know, negative impact on their health prevent us from having climate change occur? Right. I mean, it's insane. Like, you're going to kill millions.
I could make the air pollution argument all day long.
Yeah. And it's just not reasonable. So, you know, I would fight that one all day long. I don't know that it's codified that it needs to be a run to zero. I think the industry does that on its own.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
So
that's
I think
why it's harder to change. If you just changed like the rule here and there, I don't think anything would change, because 95% of professionals in the nuclear industry benefit from unreasonable radiation standards.
Yeah, but we've built our own team here from the ground up to do our own math, and we take our own arguments to the NRC. And so far we haven't run into any issues with that sort of thinking. But if you hire people from the outside, and we've done that, we brought some of those in, and we've actually hired contractors as well. They're going to drive you to that. So we kind of have to start from scratch.
Yep.
Which we've been able to do, yeah.
Okay, so you're going to get the system online hopefully soon.
Yeah.
And then how many doses? Like, when you're fully up and running, how many lives are you going to save?
Yeah, so this will be the biggest medical isotope production facility in the world. So it's going to make 20 million doses a year. Hopefully over its lifetime, 1 billion doses. So it's pretty cool. It'll be the first that I'm aware of large-scale application of fusion to benefit humanity. Some might argue the H-bomb benefited humanity. I'm not sure I would, but that's the only other really large-scale application of fusion. So that's kind of neat. And for us, it's a stepping stone. The next thing we want to do is it's pretty cool, actually, the technology we've developed here for moving around highly radioactive uranium solutions and separating out materials of value is tremendously portable to recycling nuclear spent fuel. Yeah, so that's the next plan in our business, is actually to take what we've learned here. We know what the economics of this look like. We know what the investment was. We know how it'll scale to something like a spent fuel recycling facility. So we really want to take that technology and move into the next step. We think, like I said, I think fission is a transitional step. You might think it's a permanent step. But nonetheless, we both agree it needs to happen. Cost is the biggest problem. Waste is probably the second biggest perceptually.
I'm glad you added perception. Thank you. You see, but I address perception not with technology. I address it with marketing.
Right. Yeah, so we think we can profitably run a recycling business. And
can you just walk me through the characteristics of that? Because that's super interesting, I know, to a lot of our audience.
Yeah.
What does that look like technically? What happens to what?
Right, so I'm going to talk to you about what we do now and then what we would do then. And so right now we're taking uranium, we're oxidizing it, we're dissolving it, we're irradiating it, and then we're running it through a process to separate out highly valuable materials from it. And then we're putting it back in the system. Well, what are we going to do with spent fuel? We're going to take oxide, we're going to dissolve it. We don't need to irradiate it, it's already done that. We're going to separate it, highly valuable materials, and then we're going to take some of those streams and recycle them and put them back in the reactors. So at the highest level, right, like that's what we're going to do. We would love to produce a feedstock for a MOX fuel, right? Like we've actually already spent a ton of time developing a recycling, like a sort of Urex type process is what I'll say. For separating out uranium and plutonium mixtures that would be usable as fuel. We'd also like to recoup some of the precious metals that are in the waste stream, and mostly, if you take the old stuff, mostly decayed. We'd like to be able to do that.
Actually, what precious metals are in spent nuclear fuel?
Those are things like palladium and rhodium and rhenium, and some of this really rare stuff. Now, some of it's still pretty warm, some of it's decayed away, so that's where you look at the ones you're going to focus on first. And even those can be diluted, right? So you can mix them, if you mix them 50-50 with stable stuff. I mean, they do this with steel all the time, cobalt activated. So you can dilute it and still get paid for it. We're going to be going after some of that kind of stuff as well. And then ultimately, fusion can play a role there as well, again, in the transmutation way. Where we have
ask, is that what you're thinking? That after you separate it, you group things and then you bump out the neutrons and you turn them into something else?
Yeah, so we call it kind of our phase 3A. Our phase 3 is this whole recycling business. And phase 3A is just like, making new fuel, separating out the precious metals. And then you've got a lot smaller problem to deal with because most of the original material ends up back in the reactors. You've got fission products left, and you've got, probably some true stuff left that you didn't want to put back in the reactors. That stuff, the short-lived things, you can build a building and you can hold them, right, until they kind of decay away, until they're much less dangerous. The long-lived stuff would be nice to be able to transmute it, to other isotopes. Like I-129, for example, has over a 10 million year half-life. You hit it with fast neutrons, it becomes I-128, which has a half-life in the minutes. So essentially goes away. So that's where fusion would come in. You're working on a much smaller waste stream at that point. And actually we don't need to do that to be successful in phase 3, but we'd like to do that. It's another scale up from where we're at with fusion. And actually turns out to be of the scale, similar scale to a fusion power plant. So similar to what you've seen done by the labs today, but you could probably get paid more per neutron, like we think 10 to 15 times as much per neutron for a transmuter than you could making electricity. And so we see this as a great way to cut our teeth on fusion systems that could potentially be used for electricity someday, if we could get the cost down through economies of scale and practice and things like that. So if not, we use it to help transmute long-lived waste.
Cool. So cool.
Yeah. So that's kind of where we're going, and how I'm still keeping my dream alive of participating in fusion energy while providing a sustainable company along the way. Because look, there are people trying really hard, spending lots of money on fusion R&D, but I think even if the science pans out really, really positively, this is a decade's problem in terms of the engineering. You're going to need a company that doesn't have to keep raising money for 20, 30 years, right? Like, it can help support itself. It can create real value along the way. So that's kind of what we're trying to do.
Listen, just hearing you talk, I just think of how amazing it is that you had that earlier entrepreneurial experience. You've clearly learned so much from it. It's like the way you think about this is not what I hear from most nuclear entrepreneurs who, quite frankly, are like PhDs who have like only want to reinvent the reactor core over and over again.
Yeah.
But the way you think about this, the way you think about building a business and your phased approach and your regulatory, everything is just so competent. And the product you're working on is so important. So just thank you so much for everything that you do. And thanks for taking the time to chat.
Yeah, really appreciate the opportunity. And to all your listeners, if you want to start a nuclear company, I'd love to talk to you at some point, because we learned a lot. We're getting still much better than we are even today. And I'd love to help. Nuclear should be a big part of the solution, and no need to make the same missteps we've made.
Greg Piefer, everybody.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Awesome. Thank you.
And initiate at least a new approach to the many difficult problems that must be solved in both private and public conversation if the world is to shake off the inertia imposed by fear and is to make positive progress toward peace.